I am Skallagrim Fuzzface. You killed my ad revenue. Prepare to watch. Alright, let's talk about the movie Princess Bride, which came out in 1987, and is one of the great classics. If you haven't watched it already, you should definitely do so. And it's got some great iconic scenes about left-handedness and whatnot. People have asked how realistic the duels are in Princess Bride, and you have to keep in mind that this is a fantasy adventure movie with quite a bit of comedy in there, so it's not exactly aiming for gritty realism. Before we go on, I want to give thanks to the sponsor for this video, Vikings War of Clans, which is inspired by the strategy and RPG games of the 90s, you know, Warcraft, Command & Conquer, Wizardry, Heroes of Might and Magic. Everyone has played those. What? Oh right, the 90s are not 10 years ago anymore. Vikings got over 20 million online players signed up to decide the course of the game by constantly fighting over resources, forming alliances, backstabbing each other, competing in live events, and other fun shenanigans. So help support this channel by downloading Vikings for free through my links in the video description down below. That also get you 200 gold and a protective shield as a special bonus. Comes in handy to start out. Alright. Back to the other Skall. The practice of HEMA had its humble beginnings in the 1990s, and it became more widespread really only in the recent decade or so. So also, fight choreographies in most 80s movies are very far removed from historical combat by default, and some are downright laughably fake and silly looking. However, Princess Bride is a little special because it actually throws around the names of real historical fencing masters. I'll get to that later. So first off, spoiler alert. This is going to be pretty obvious because I'll talk about specific scenes and show some from the movie, hopefully without copyright strikes and whatnot. Inigo uses a very ornate rapier. Both of their swords seem to be about as light as small swords, considering how effortlessly they whip them around. They move them very fast. Now, a rapier is balanced for quick and easy point control, but the mass isn't as low as a lot of people seem to think. It's really more similar to arming swords. In fact, even some Viking swords. Some rapiers can be relatively heavy-ish by sword standards, but most of the mass is in the hilt. So again, the balance allows you to move the point pretty easily, which you need. Wesly Sword is an earlier type of rapier. You could even call it a proto-rapier or a side sword, depending on how you want to interpret and apply the classifications. And it looks a lot like what Joachim Meyer in his manuscript calls a rapier, except that this one has 2 rings instead of 1. So this type of sword was used a bit differently than the later Italian rapier, which has a longer, narrower blade and a much more elaborate hilt with more hand protection. First off, I like the footwork in this scene. I could nitpick here and there. For example, it's overall quite linear. They, for the most part, just go back and forth. But it does a good job of making them look both agile and skilled. It's very fast. They're both quick on their feet, and there's a nice back and forth dynamic. And scenes like this are really well done visually. You've got quick thrusts and parries and counter thrusts. Sometimes they throw proper committed cuts. A lot of the time it's these little love taps against the blade that don't actually threaten anyone and that they don't even really need to defend. This is excusable for a choreography where you want to convey speed and agility and skill without constant camera cuts. So this makes it very enjoyable to watch, seeing that it's one smooth, continuous sequence without constantly changing their perspective, especially if you compare that to a lot of more recent movies that are completely over-edited, where you have a cut every 2 seconds, confusing angles, shaky camera, all of that. So this is actually pretty well done, even though you can nitpick it. However, here's the problem. This is not actually how you fight with rapiers. or side swords for that matter. To be fair, in this scene, you have committed cuts, proper parries, but you also have thrusts that are generally done by pistoning the arm forward instead of actually lunging and putting body weight behind the thrust, which makes it more powerful and harder to defend, and also it doesn't telegraph the thrust. I mean, which thrust do you see first? This or this? There's also occasional spinning, which is viable against multiple opponents and can sometimes be pulled off in hand-to-hand combat. But against a fencing master, that's a way to get stabbed in the back while you're trying to be fabulous. And then there are bizarre shenanigans like this. Again, it's a comedy adventure movie, so you gotta cut it some slack. This point down swipe here is really more what I would call an oh shit parry. There's a better way of doing it where you actually control the opponent's blade and launch a thrust of your own very shortly after, or even simultaneously. Okay, so they actually reference historical fencing masters.
You're using Bonetti's defense against me, huh?
The Italian Rocco Bonetti existed. He lived in the 16th century, and he was mortally wounded in front of his own school in a duel with the Englishman Austin Bagger around 1590. The kicker is we don't actually know anything about how he fought. He didn't write a manuscript, or if he did, it wasn't preserved. So the movie seems to refer to focusing on just parries without attacking, which is safer on treacherous ground here. So that makes sense at face value, but at the same time, if you're dealing with uneven ground, it's actually better to just lower your stance, lower and widen it, so you have more secure footing and you can still attack. Now, you shouldn't do a wide, long, deep lunge, because that would indeed be risky on terrain like that, but you could still counterattack. And the problem is, if you do nothing but defend all the time, eventually you're going to get hit. It's only a matter of time. If the opponent has the initiative and you don't take it back and they just keep pushing and keep attacking, then you're going to make a mistake sooner or later. To be fair, Westley here is supposed to be a master swordsman and supposed to be more skilled than Inigo, so he could probably keep this up for quite a while without making a mistake.
You must expect me to attack with Capo Ferro.
Alright, so Capo Ferro was an Italian fencing master who wrote his treatise in 1610. And how do you attack with Capo Ferro? Do you throw the man's body at someone? Jokes aside, Capo Ferro does have characteristic techniques and strategies in his system. And you can see the fairly deep stance, a strong lean, a far-reaching linear lunge, a focus on seizing control of the center line, things like that. But there's still a lot of different ways to attack that you could pick from the system. So you can't necessarily attack with Capo Ferro. You would still have to pick something from Capo Ferro's system.
But I find that Thibault cancels out Capo Ferro.
I'm honestly impressed to hear that in a movie from the late 80s, before HEMA became a thing. So Gérard Thibault d'Anvers, which I may have mispronounced a little bit. It was a Dutch fencing master who wrote his treatise in 1630. And this is a very different system. You have a completely upright stance with a different grip, the rapier pointing straight at the opponent, and this builds on geometry to place yourself in a mechanically superior position. There's a lot of circular movement, so this can indeed counter Capo Ferro's linear lunge, although the Italian system also has some lateral movement. But this goes both ways. Some of Capo Ferro's techniques would also be difficult for a Thibault fencer to deal with. So it all really depends on individual skill. It's a nice reference, and it makes certain sense, for sure. However, then we've got this statement.
Unless the enemy has a study, he's Agrippa.
Okay, so Camillo Agrippa was an architect, engineer, and mathematician, and this really shows in his 1553 rapier fencing treatise on the science of arms. Now, this is all about geometric angles and biomechanics. I wish I could give you an answer about how Agrippa might help defend against Thibault, but Personally, I've received professional instruction on Capo Ferro, even though I'm still on beginner level, basically. It's very complex and takes a long time to learn. And I've also received sort of a crash course on Thibault, but I'm not familiar with Agrippa, so I can't really tell you. It's an earlier style. The swords in Agrippa's treatise really look more like side swords, and they have a shorter blade than Capo Ferro's rapier. The funny part, though, is that actually looking at the way they're fighting, those names that they throw in are almost like the movie's version of technobabble. They're interesting references, and on paper they make sense, but what they do is completely different. Their stance, footwork, and thrusts look really nothing like either Capo Ferro or Thibault, especially not Thibault. That would look entirely different. In rapier fencing, it's essential to maintain blade contact so you can feel what the opponent is doing and then act accordingly. This is much safer. It's crucial to constrain the opponent's blade before attacking, so you don't run into the problem that both lunge at the same time and run each other through, which is actually mentioned in the historical manuals. It's a problem that untrained, hot-headed nobles sometimes ran into. They were just eager to prove themselves and didn't really have a lot of professional training, and they ended up running each other through. Speaking of hot-headed, this, by the way, is not at all how you use a rapier. This looks more like a ham-fisted, angry version of Polish saber cross-cutting. Anyway, let that be enough for now. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider supporting me on Patreon if you don't already, or subscribe star, or by shopping on Amazon or Kult of Athena, etc., etc. There's a bunch of links down below, so check those out. And thanks for watching. Have a good one, folks. Princess Bride, which came out in 1897. 1897. I think it would look a little different if it came out in 1897, don't you think? Came out in 1890... Again? Apparently my subconscious really wants this movie to be Victorian.